Okay, I think we've hit about critical mass. Again, good morning. I think we've got just enough folks to get started. So if you do miss anything, just know we'll be recording today's presentation and then we're going to post it on the Foundation's website following today's meeting. So for those of you I don't already know yet, my name is Kim Theodore Seide, and I'm a member of the Community Impact team here at the Foundation. And I am so fortunate to be our staff lead on all things related to the Women's Fund, including our grant making and fundraising. And I'm delighted to just have an opportunity to share a little bit about this year's grant cycle. We've got a pretty packed agenda for today, and I want to make sure we have time to cover everything. So originally we were planning for about 30 minutes together. That's still the plan. There's a lot of information to get through though. So just know that we're planning for about a 30-minute presentation, followed by a 10 to 15 minute time for Q&A as needed. So feel free to join in the bits that are the most helpful and then use the Q&A feature to send any questions you may have as they come up. My colleague Megan Longley is going to be monitoring the chat and can answer any questions, and then we'll also address these at the end too. So just a heads up, here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with an overview of the Women's Fund and how our strategies have evolved. We'll then zero in on our funding priorities for this grant cycle. I'll cover our eligibility requirements, and then we'll dig in a bit deeper on the specifics of this year's application and how proposals will be evaluated and grant partners will be selected. And then we'll conclude with just a couple of FAQs and tips for first-time applicants, as well as opening it up to questions. So let's get started. As many of you know, the Women's Fund was founded in 2004 to focus on the needs of women and children in Central Texas. At the time, there was a lack of philanthropic support targeting the unique needs of women. And I would say this slide here really represents just the broad nature of the Women's Fund work from its founding in 2004 to about 2016, which was to really just define the focus in terms of intended beneficiaries, but not necessarily by specific issues or needs. This allowed the fund to serve a variety of different nonprofits. And during this time, I would say our giving was less. The program grants tended to be in the $5,000 to $15,000 range. And because we didn't have this guiding specific strategy, it was difficult for us to provide feedback to applicants without just a more focused strategy. So then in 2016, staff at the Foundation recognized that the Women's Fund could be and is a key strategy of ACF to close the opportunity gap. So as such, the Women's Fund really committed to supporting the economic security of women. And the Women's Fund is community-led and data-informed. And it was really these two inputs that defined our strategies, which are the building blocks for economic security. I know many of you on the call are probably familiar with or have applied for grants in these areas, but we began making grants in housing, childcare, education, and unintended pregnancy prevention. And that first grant cycle with this strategy, it was in 2018. And that's when we really began making much larger program grants. We used to make $50,000 grants in each of these areas. These strategies also, I would say, really spoke to our donors. And as a result, we were fortunate to increase the number of individuals involved in the grants review process, though at that time it was still restricted to investors in the fund. And this slide encapsulates the strategic direction of the Women's Fund from 2016 to really our most recent grant cycle, though the pivot we took in 22 in response to the pandemic really opened the door for a more broad distribution of grants. And for the first time, general operating support. That was the first time in the fund's history that we had not made program grants, but general operating support grants. So this next slide here, I would say, reflects where the Women's Fund currently is in our strategy evolution. The Women's Fund recognizes that our focus on the economic security of women must be explicit in its focus of women of color. And with this, we also acknowledge that processes can favor larger white-led nonprofits and that leaders of color are often best positioned to serve communities of color. So as such, this year's grant cycle reflects community voice and nonprofit leader input. We'll talk a little bit more about that input, and then also with data and investor input. So as you can see in this slide here, it just illustrates just how much change the Women's Fund has undergone in a relatively short period of time, and also our intentional commitment to widen the circle of influence in funding decisions. Last fall, we undertook a substantial process to gather feedback and listen to our community, and truly resulting in a co-created grants process. We are so grateful to the community members who played a role in designing our 2021 grants, and who will also be participating in the grants review. I'm super excited to share more about that. But first, let's talk a little bit about the strategies for this year's grants. So this year, the Women's Fund will be making grants in 5 different areas. For those of you that have applied in the past, you'll see they haven't changed too substantially, but the process we undertook last fall, I would say, really affirmed and reinforced our commitment to the building blocks of economic security. I mean, I don't think I need to tell anyone on this call, there are real needs here in these areas, which the pandemic has only exacerbated. And these strategies reflect key learnings, inclusive language, and an emphasis on systemic change in a way that the Women's Fund has not done before. So this year, the Women's Fund will be investing in programs and organizations that support affordable housing for women that includes a network of support and our opportunities for long-term wealth building. In our childcare strategy, we hope to expand access to safe, quality, culturally competent, and affordable care that is conveniently located for families with low incomes. In education, we want to provide access to an ecosystem of support, financial, emotional, academic, for women pursuing their educational dreams. And this year, this is a new addition. We're really excited to provide a new funding opportunity. We are going to be adding women's health grants specifically to reduce health disparities faced by women of color. That's in addition to our unintended pregnancy prevention area, which please note has substantially broadened this year. It's no longer limited to LARCs. The aim is really to increase access to consumable, unbiased pregnancy prevention resources. So in total, we're going to be granting out $400,000 in unrestricted general operating support to 20 different agencies. That means there's going to be 4 grants in each category. One winning finalist following voting, that grant partner receives a $40,000 multi-year grant, so $20,000 in this year and $20,000 in the following year. The runner-up finalist in each category will receive $20,000, and then the 2 semifinalists in each category receive a grant of $10,000. We really wanted to be able to continue that best practice of providing general operating support and distribute funding more broadly to increase the number of grant partners, because we know there is a lot of need right now. Okay, so how's this going to happen, and who's eligible to apply for a Women's Fund grant? In general, the Women's Fund eligibility guidelines follow the same guidelines as our other grant-making programs at the foundation. This means you need to be a tax-exempt organization or unit of government doing work in the 6-county Central Texas region. That includes fiscally sponsored projects. In general, the foundation does not make grants to endowment funds, religious organizations for religious purposes, fundraising or events, political lobbying or ledge activities, and we don't make grants directly to individuals. A couple of other eligibility considerations, and these are specific to the Women's Fund. We will consider proposals that engage in non-lobbying advocacy work. We recognize that in many of our pillars and areas, in order to engage in systemic change, that's a critical part of increasing access. So agencies engaged in educating the public about issues, community organizing, policy research, any other non-lobbying advocacy activities, you can apply. You don't have to be engaged in this work, just know that it wouldn't preclude you from applying. Proposals will also be considered from religious organizations that have non-religious programming. If you are a religious organization and choose to apply, please just make sure to demonstrate in your application, and this is really important because we moved from program support to general operating support, that when you describe the work that you do that aligns with our strategies, that you make sure to connect that it is secular in nature and does not discriminate against any employee or clients based on religion. Also, one important note, and this is specific to our newest funding category, but because the Women Health Grants are made possible in thanks to generous support from the St. David's Foundation, please know that that grant is intended for non-clinical services, and the funds can be not utilized to subsidize uninsured or unfunded patients who are served under a contract with Central Health. That only applies to that tackling health disparities category, not unintended pregnancy prevention. Finally, if you are a past grantee, you are eligible to apply, though you'll need to submit a progress report along with your application if you're in an active grant cycle. So when you log into the grant portal, you'll be able to access that from the home page on the portal. And also, this probably goes without saying, but just a reminder, the Women's Fund operates independently of our other grant programs at the foundation. So if you've received a community grant or a Hispanic Impact Fund grant from ACF, you can also apply for a Women's Fund grant. Okay, so let's dig into the application and review process. The process starts with submitting an application, which is due Thursday, January 28th at 5 p.m. That's 2 weeks from today that all applications are going to be due. Like last year, there will be no LOI. We wanted to give all organizations an opportunity to fully tell their story and share their work. The full review process in total takes just a little over 3 months. We're going to go into detail about all of these different areas. But just in summary, know that once applications are submitted, they're scored by Women's Fund investors and community reviewers. That takes place throughout the month of February. Then at the end of the month, 4 semifinalists will be selected from each of the 5 grant categories. So 20 semifinalists total. All semifinalists will be funded. The later stages of the process just really determine the funding level. So semifinalists are invited to participate in Zoom learning sessions, which will inform the selection of 2 finalists. 2 finalists from each category then proceed to the voting stage, and investors and community reviewers will vote on the final grant recipients in early May. So again, I'll go over each stage of the process in a little more detail. Just wanted to provide an overview of the total review process. And as applications are due in 2 weeks, let's start there. So our grant cycle opened on December 10th. And like I mentioned, all applications are due January 28th at 5 p.m. You will need to log into your account in the ACF grants portal to submit an application. If you are a first-time applicant, you'll need to create a login. There's a link to do this on the ACF. There's a link to the ACF grants portal on the Women's Fund RFP page, which is that website that you see here on this slide. So once you've visited that, you'll be able to log in and get into the ACF grants portal that way. Once you've created an account and logged in, there are 8 sections to the application this year. The first step is that you'll confirm you're eligible to apply, and then you'll enter any relevant contact information. The second, and this is definitely a new section to the application this year, you're going to be entering equity data. So you'll be providing the percentages of individuals associated with your agency that identify as non-white. Specifically in 4 categories, this data is broken out by your executive leadership, board, staff, and your clients or patrons. Then the next section is your proposed work and impact. And this is where most of the questions are. You're going to first start by checking all the Women's Fund strategies that apply to your organization's work. And then you'll have a space to address how your work aligns with each Women's Fund strategy. If there isn't an alignment in a certain area, that's completely okay. You can just write not applicable for that section. Just fill out the ones that apply. Please do not be deterred. Also, if you can only fill out one, we understand that that's going to be the case with many agencies, and that shouldn't deter you from applying. But you'll use this section to then describe the work that you do in each of these areas. And then you're also going to use this section to describe the work that you'll undertake using a grant. And in this section, we highly recommend that you also articulate the catalyst for the programming and the communities involved in designing the solution. This section also asks you to provide information on your organization's history with the priority population and cultural competency, as well as the percentage of those you intend to serve that are at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. Then the sections that follow are really more kind of logistical and administrative. We do ask for a brief description, 150 words or less, to describe your work. This is only used for voting. Should your organization proceed to the final stage, that's what folks will see. They're going to see something that you've written. And actually, this is the only part of the application that has any kind of character or word limits. Because our grants management system actually requires that we put limits in, we just set them as high as possible. But we know that sometimes putting in those word limits can make it more difficult to sometimes submit an application. So just know that's the only place where you should run into character or word limits. We also asked for a couple of dates that work for all folks that you anticipate might be a part of the Zoom learning session. Should your organization proceed to the semifinalist stage, this just helps us with scheduling later. And then once you've submitted these dates, please hold them with anyone that you think would like to participate. This helps a ton later when we are organizing meetings with your team and all grants reviewers, because of course calendars might be open now and then might be full later. So please, just a calendar request or a meeting request can go a long way in just holding dates. And then we will have an easier time scheduling all of these later when we get to the semifinalist stage. In lieu of a long list of attachments, we've included an assurances checklist that primarily covers issues related to finances and governance. So just make sure to check all the criteria that's applicable. And then if you can't check any of those areas, there's a space to provide rationale for anything that you're unable to check. There are actually only 2 attachments that will be required this year: your IRS determination letter or proof of fiscal sponsorship if applicable, and then your agency's operating budget. And there's no template for the budget this year. I mean, I can't hear the cheers because this is a webinar, but I'm imagining cheers across Zoom land. There's no template. We wanted this to be as easy as possible. So the budget can just be a pre-existing working document. It just needs to be current and reflect your current fiscal year. All right, a couple other considerations. This first one's really important. I think probably the greatest thing, if you can take anything from this webinar, is I cannot emphasize this enough, and it's that I highly encourage everyone to review 2 resources on the Women's Fund RFP webpage. As you draft your application, please make sure to reference the scoring rubric and the guiding definitions. These will both be really helpful in providing an understanding of how your application is going to be evaluated. In the case of the scoring rubric, you'll actually be able to directly see how it ties back to the application and the number of points that are awarded for each category. The guiding definitions are really meant to help provide some clarity and then context to the Women's Fund strategies. We know that some of the terms in our strategies can be interpreted differently, and they provide clarity on just what we mean by and how the grants committee and community reviewers will interpret what we mean by affordable housing, or what a woman pursuing her educational dreams means, or like ages for childcare and that kind of thing, which we define quite broadly. So another thing to just note is that when you submit, you're submitting one application that can be considered for multiple grant categories. This is why we ask folks to check all the strategies that are applicable. We recognize that some folks may only check one box. That's totally okay, but we don't want folks who could apply for multiple to be hindered by that part of the process. So you don't have to choose a category. I do want to point out, though, that while an applicant can be considered in multiple categories, they can only proceed to the semifinalist stage in the category in which they scored or ranked the highest. We're really committed to funding 20 different organizations, so applicants can only receive one Women's Fund grant per grant cycle. Okay, application scoring. So first, who reviews your application? Staff's going to do an initial review to confirm eligibility, and then what we'll do is we'll pass that along to a group of scorers comprised of Women's Fund investors and community reviewers who will score your application using that scoring rubric that I mentioned that's on the Women's Fund website. Women's Fund investors are donors to the Women's Fund who also donate their time. Community reviewers are provided a stipend for scoring applications, and all scorers must participate in an implicit bias training offered by the Women's Fund and disclose any conflict of interest. So your application also cannot be reviewed by anyone that has a relationship with your organization. Folks like donors or board members or clients to your agency, they're certainly welcome to participate in the process as either Women's Fund investors or community reviewers, but once they've disclosed that conflict of interest, they will not be assigned your application. Community viewers, who are these folks? These are new to the grant process. We're super excited to have community reviewers be a part of the review process this year. They are members of the community who bring diverse lived experiences and expertise to this work. They're also likely to be representative of the communities most likely to be served by a Women's Fund grant. So as mentioned, the application will be scored using the scoring rubric on the Women's Fund RFP webpage, which includes an equity lens. The rubric directly ties back to each question in the application, so you can see exactly how you'll be scored. The rubric prioritizes diversity and partnerships with communities served. And like I mentioned before, it can't hurt to say it again, but we highly encourage you to review this rubric and the guiding definitions to understand how your application is going to be evaluated. Okay, so just moving on, let's just say it's the end of February, you received good news, you're going to be a Women's Fund grant partner, and you're moving to the semifinalist stage. You will then participate in a Zoom learning session. So let's talk about what that looks like. For all the obvious reasons this year, we can't do in-person site visits. In lieu, we'll be hosting Zoom learning sessions. These are going to be short, no more than an hour, and it's really an opportunity to meet with Women's Fund investors and your team. We don't stipulate who from your team should be on the call, but we found it helpful to have a member of your executive leadership team and your programming team join. Foundation staff will then coordinate the timing and send questions ahead of the meeting. And if you have questions for the Women's Fund, we also encourage you to send those in advance too. All right, then following the Zoom learning sessions, staff's going to be in touch to confirm semifinalists and then also which organizations are moving to the finalist stage for investor and community reviewer voting. Voting, again, is going to take place online, and it usually happens over the course of a week. A couple of changes this year, though. Voting is open to all Women's Fund investors and community reviewers. So all investors, not just the ones on the grants committee, and then also all our folks that will be scoring applications. Voting will also be done without any identifying information to curb implicit bias. So investors and community reviewers will vote based on the description included in your application that shouldn't include identifying information. That way they don't actually know your organization's name. They're voting based off of the project description, the description of the work that you're doing, and not necessarily by like name brand recognition. Then after all the votes have been tallied, staff will be in touch to confirm grant awards, and we'll celebrate all of the grantees in mid-May. So that's like the quick 20-minute version of the grant cycle in a nutshell. I'm sure there's going to be questions. And I want to thank all the folks who already submitted questions in advance. This was super helpful and provided a really great framework, I think, for this section. So at this point, feel free to submit any questions you may have in the Q&A. Megan's going to act as a moderator and facilitate these questions. And actually, while these get submitted, I thought we could maybe start with a few questions we received already and just ones that we tend to get a lot, as well as share some tips too. So the first question is, how will I know if my application's declined? We talk a lot about like what happens if you move forward in the process. And if it doesn't, just know that you'll hear from us at the end of February. Please understand we get a lot of really worthy applications and really meaningful work, but we have limited resources, and we can't fund everything that we receive an application for. So one of the recommendations that came out of the work we did last fall is just to try and make this process as transparent as possible. And we're really committed to that. So if your application is declined, please feel free to email me to schedule a call. My contact information is on the foundation website. I also have a slide with my email on there as well. But call me to schedule a call. What we'll do is we'll go and we'll review your scores so you can get a sense of where you scored higher or lower. And then if the committee had any specific feedback, I'll be able to share that at that time as well. So this next question here, we get a lot as well. And the short answer to this question, the question being, we don't exclusively serve women, can we still apply? The short answer is yes. You can apply if you serve all genders. And just know this is also the case for many of our past grantees as well. That said, if your agency serves all genders, I would encourage in your application to just connect directly how a Women's Fund grant would specifically fund individuals who identify as female, because that's our priority population. All right, this next question, how do we define health disparities? Does this include mental health? I love this question because I get to remind everybody again for like the third or fourth time, check out the guiding definitions on our website. We define health disparities as referring to a higher burden and incidence of illness, injury, disability, or mortality experienced by one group relative to another. And though not explicitly stated, this includes both mental and physical health. So actually, in fact, mental health was one of the main issues that came up in some of the community feedback sessions that we had facilitated by Measure when we were incorporating community voice into our grants review process. So work addressing mental health would certainly be something that we would consider funding. These questions here, age restrictions. Funding specifically dedicated to girls and the elderly. These both really talk about strategic fit and alignment. Again, check out our guiding definitions. The only area where we really provide restrictions around age is how we define childcare, which we define quite broadly to include early childhood, but also out of school time and after school time. In our education category, we do define a woman pursuing her educational dreams as an adolescent through the rest of her life. So again, a really broad definition and view of that. Programs that serving the female elderly would certainly be applicable. And then do you have any tips for first-time applicants? I do. We've already covered a lot of this, but just a few tips that we see that tend to be really helpful for first-time applicants. First, just a reminder about reviewing the guidelines, scoring rubric. I sound like a broken record, but again, I cannot recommend this enough. The second tip is really important. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of folks reading your application. So as you write, just keep in mind your audience is really broad and you're gonna have folks with a diverse array of lived experiences, beliefs, cultures, and expertise. So just be careful to avoid industry-specific jargon or acronyms to give them, and just take the time to give the needed context, because not everybody is going to be a specialist in your issue areas the way you are. And one way we found that's really helpful to check for that is to have someone not familiar with your program or organization read your application and then ask them if they have questions or if anything's unclear. If they do, it's likely our application scores are going to as well. Also, our staff is always here to help, but especially with us all being remote right now, it's so much easier for us to do this when we have the time to help. Some of us still have kids at home. We're all on kind of different schedules. So if you can submit early, and we recognize not everybody can, but if you can, please try to submit earlier than the deadline. That way, if you run into any issues or any last minute questions, we can help you with getting your application submitted or addressing any questions you may have. So that's the last of like the kind of common FAQs I have. Megan, do you have any questions that were submitted through the Q&A you want to share?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Good to be here and great information, Kim, and great questions coming in through the chat and the Q&A. One question is around filling out staff and board demographic information and whether or not interns can be included as part of the staff.
Yeah, I think that applies. I mean, whether they're paid or unpaid interns, they're a vital and important part of the work that you're doing. So we would certainly like to see them counted.
Great. And then here's another one about do we have examples of what non-clinical services are in that health category?
Yeah, so again, I mean, this seems probably pretty obvious, but like anything that takes outside of a clinical setting, educational programming tends to be like the first thing that comes to mind. It is a brand new grants category, so I can't point to past grantees yet at this point, but if you have specific questions about whether your work would apply to, that's a really good thing to kind of follow up on a case-by-case basis as well.
Thanks, Kim. Here's another question about if an organization addresses all four areas, will we choose from that list, or will the organization provide laser focus on just one program? And how does the organization articulate that they'd really be open to funding in any area?
Yeah, so the way that works, when you log into the application, you're going to click on a check mark, essentially, all of the strategies that align with what you do. Then there's a space below to talk about the work that you do that aligns. So you're going to have an opportunity to address exactly how you fit with each of those categories. Then your application will go to the subcommittees for all of the strategies that you've checked, and they're going to review it then. So you'll be considered for all of those different grant categories. You'll only proceed to the semifinalist stage if selected as a semifinalist in the one that you scored highest, because it's entirely possible if you're just an amazing group that's doing this incredible work, you could actually score high enough to proceed in the semifinalist stage in like housing and childcare. And if that were the case, the category in which you scored highest is the one that you proceed in. And we have a whole system for alternates and how that all works out. But just know you don't have to select one area. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Um, Yasmin, let me know if we didn't. And then another question, Kim, can you talk a little bit about how we're going about recruiting community reviewers?
Oh, yeah. I'm so glad this question got asked. Thank you. So, we have been reaching out to nonprofit agencies, our partnerships at Measure and the Community Resilience Trust to recruit community reviewers. Our aim is to have kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. And right now, that's kind of what it's shaking out in terms of total investors with community reviewers. But the idea being that this is in introducing folks that would be most likely to be receiving services that benefit from a Women's Fund grant in the decision-making process. So that's how folks have been recruited. They're signing up and then of course will be compensated for their time too through a stipend. And actually, if you know of folks that you think might want to participate in that process, I can put a link to this in the chat. But basically, this is a blog article with links to share that opportunity as well with folks. Put that in the chat right here.
Thanks, Kim. And then another question about, are we asking for a specific program budget or is it just an agency budget or both?
It's just an agency budget. That's it. No program budget because it's not project support. So just one budget and no budget template. You just submit a working document for your agency.
Everything that was asked in the chat and in the Q&A has been answered and through your very thorough presentation, Kim. Anything else?
I want to thank you all for interest in this work. We're super excited. And just know that as you kind of continue working on your applications, staff is here to help. So please feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. I've included my contact information as well as my colleague, Sarah Watson. And just please feel free to count on us and as resources at the foundation, along with the types of questions that staff is best positioned to answer. You don't want to ask me questions about the online portal, or like if you're having trouble with the technical side of stuff, I'm really probably not going to be able to help you very well. So please, steer those questions towards Sarah. I'm a good fit for talking about the rubric or any kind of reviewer feedback or questions about strategic fit. But just know that we'd be happy to help. And we're so glad that you joined us for today. And we look forward to learning more about your work. Thank you all.